Okay, good morning and welcome to our Bible class hour. If you'd like to find a seat, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. And I saw that Kenny fixed our clock for us, so appreciate that, Kenny, wherever he went. I figure eventually they'll notice. So, yeah, we lost electricity at the building. What day was that, Sarah? A couple days ago we lost electricity, and I guess nobody noticed that the clock was off, and so it looked, not beforehand, I mean, and so it looked like just... On Wednesday. Not that I know of, but maybe we are about this. So if you were watching the clock during worship and thinking, wow, this is we're getting done really early, and Kenny fixed that for us, so thanks. We are in Genesis 4 this morning. If you'd like to open to Genesis chapter 4, and we're going to continue. We've been looking at Genesis sort of more from trying to, anyway, an apologetic standpoint of the difficulties that sometimes people have that might cast some amount of doubt or shadow upon the Bible, and just trying to work through some of those things and maybe kind of confirm our faith and just kind of see, how would Moses and the Israelites understand it, because oftentimes that kind of clears it up for us, and we can say, oh, really there's this really makes a lot of sense. And so we've looked at the first couple of chapters of Genesis. And this morning we're going to be in Genesis 4, which centers, of course, around Cain and Abel and the events that happened between them and God. And then following that, Cain's family and sort of the generations that followed Cain, and it kind of implied or stated some directly the trouble that they got into leading up to the flood before we get to Genesis 5. And so, but before we start Genesis 4, as I've kind of done every week so far, is there any particular thoughts or things that you've heard are confusing to people, or anything in particular from Genesis 4 that you would like to focus on this morning as we're talking about apologetics or confusing things in Genesis 4? I figure if I ask that question often enough, y'all will maybe look ahead of time before you get here and see what you think. So
I don't want to take up the whole service time, but I'm still confused over the appearance of the serpent.
The appearance of the serpent. Okay. Well, let's deal a little bit with Genesis 4, and then maybe if we have some time at the end, we can come back around to that. So that sounds good. Anything from Genesis 4? All right. Well, let's go ahead and turn to verse 11 then, and notice a few things there in verse 11. Up to verse 11, you've had the encounter that Cain and Abel and God had when they both brought their sacrifices. And Abel brought a sacrifice with blood, and Cain brought a sacrifice that was some kind of grain based on their professions, the things that they spent most of their time with. Is it just rubbing on it? Is that what it is? I'm sorry about that, y'all. And let's see if we can fix that. Isn't this what y'all got out of bed for this morning? Watch the preacher play with his mic. That's why I got out of bed.
We gave you a lot of time.
It's not on.
No, it's not. I turned it off because I was going to play with it. Okay. Maybe it won't rub now. We'll see. All right. So, they have this encounter, and they each bring their offering. But it says that God didn't look at Cain's. He didn't accept Cain's He wasn't pleased with Cain's. And First John kind of gives us a little more information about some of that, but specifically doesn't tell us any specific reason why, other than just that there was something about Cain's offering or his heart or both that was unacceptable to God. But Abel's was righteous, and so he accepted Abel's sacrifice. And it's interesting because it does tell us several things about the world then, in that while we don't know a lot about the specifics, God clearly had communicated to Adam and Eve, and therefore to their descendants, about some things that are very similar to what he communicated to Moses about what's right and what's wrong. If you sin, there's maybe they're doing sin sacrifices. Maybe these are sacrifices of thanksgiving, but there's clearly some kinds of sacrifices that they're performing, and so they, God really has always been the same. And while we don't know all the particulars, we do see the similarities and the consistency there. And of course, then Cain gets really upset about this, and instead of sort of saying, well, this is the Almighty God who loves me and knows everything and is just really looking out for what's best, what can I change to be right with him? He sort of takes his anger out on his brother in the most extreme form possible, and then really regrets it. Not so much, you don't get the sense he regrets it because it was wrong, but because the consequences are just too big for him to be happy about, and sort of the problem that comes. And it's this really great picture of really what happens to us each and every time that we have temptation. Its desire is to rule over you. When you have temptation, you're in the same place that Cain was, and you can either choose to walk toward that temptation like Cain did, or walk away from it. As God says, you can rule over it. You don't have to be a victim of your temptation. You can rule over it. But in verse 11, it says, "So now you are cursed from the earth." This is the consequence he gets, "which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you." And that's already the curse that God put on Adam. So the ground is already like that, but it seems that Cain is going to have an especially difficult time. "A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." And the Lord said to him, you really see even God's mercy here at this point, "Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him." And so, sometimes you hear that about God, that the God of the Bible is all like vengeance and anger, and he rains down fire and brimstone, and the God of the Old Testament is, and the God of the New Testament is all, like love and compassion and just a very meek, gentle kind of guy who wouldn't hurt a fly. And so you can sometimes hear these two pictures, but you notice that even in chapters 3 and 4, you get both sides of God, because there is the consequence that comes from sin. But then God also, in chapter 3, as we talked about, he makes the sacrifice of the animals for their sins, and then clothes them and sends them out into the world. It's difficult, but with the opportunity to survive and to obey and to have the children and all those things. And then same thing with Cain, there is the consequence. He killed his brother. Even today, most people would agree, if you kill your brother, you should be taken to court, and something should be done about that. And that's most people would agree that that's right. Well, that's all that happened here. Cain killed his brother, and he was taken to God's courtroom in essence and given a consequence. But as he expresses to God what his thoughts are of this, God even shows a degree of mercy, and so you get both sides of God, even here in the very beginning. And so, of course, chapters 1 and 2 really show us the good sides of God that people say don't exist in the Old Testament. But while we do see God's righteous judgment, we also see his mercy even here. And so, and that correlates well. You think about Jesus. Is it true that Jesus really only ever says things that are just like nice and polite and friendly? Is that true of Jesus? Can we think of examples where Jesus said things that are really much more in line with the perception of the Old Testament?
Like that whip.
Okay, yeah, he made the whip, and you do see he has a great deal of self-control. Like he sat down and he braided a whip. Nobody who's having a temper fit braids a whip first, but there is that there is that degree of he's going to flip the tables over and drive the animals out and make sure the people are leaving to show them his zeal for God's holy character and how what they're doing is wrong. And so yeah, that's definitely not a 21st century idea of tolerance and love that people tend to put on Jesus. Yes, ma'am. There's someone else that mentioned
He
something.
also called the Jewish leaders vipers so many times.
Okay, yes. So there's
worse.
Yeah.
Even worse.
and worse, yeah. Well, brood of vipers is really pretty ugly. The idea a viper is an animal that there's eggs all over, and then the snakes will a whole bunch of male snakes will come and crawl all over them, and do what male animals do. And so then at the end of the day, if you were to pick up one of the eggs, you would have no way to know which snake had fertilized it. And so when he says brood of vipers, he's saying you claim that your father is God, but do you really know who your father is? It's really a pretty ugly insult at the end of the day. But yeah, he says kind of a lot of things like that. And it's not you do get this, Ephesians 4 says, speak the truth in love. And so you know that Jesus is speaking truth. And you know that he doesn't ever break God's commands, and so he spoke it in love. And yet still, because of the severity of their heart, how hard it was, and I know we talked about Stephen in this class a few times. Stephen does the same thing. He calls them, stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart. And it's like, why is he using such strong language? Because he looks at them and he says, man, you are hard-hearted. It's going to take a little extra, right? Jude says, pull some out of the fire, with urgency, with whatever it takes. It's going to take a little extra to break through to you. I hope it works. In Stephen's case, it didn't, and they killed him. If it had worked, though, they would have all been brothers in Christ at the end of the day. And so, you do have this sort of measured and choice. It's definitely not rash. Sometimes when we call people's names, it's because we're mad, right? For Jesus, it's not rash. It's a measured choice. But he's thinking, what is it going to take to break through to them? And that's not our definition of tolerance and love that people try to put on Jesus today. So I think I heard something else right over here.
Oh, like watch sepulchres.
Okay, so very similar, yeah. Why watch sepulchres? It's also Jesus that we're told in that's a good one. The tomb is so beautiful on the outside and it's just dead on the inside. It's really a very vivid illustration. We're also told that Jesus in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, he is the one who comes back in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who do not know God and those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so he is depicted as someone who has no righteous judgment, someone who has and he wouldn't swat a fly. But the Bible depicts him as the one carrying the sword who slays those who don't obey him. And so, that's it can be tricky for our world today to put both of those pieces together. But when we're looking at the Bible as a whole, that's who Jesus has always been, and that's who Jesus will always be. And that's exactly who he was in Genesis 4, the same as who he was in the book of John, where he calls them brood of vipers in chapter 8. But then he also tells people in chapter 10, chapter 8 even, he says, you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. He's the one who wants to make you free from sin because he loves you so much. John 3:16 is, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Now, it's important to know what love means, and that's where I think where people get confused. 1 John 4 describes love in a biblical sense, and not in sort of the tolerant, you can do whatever you want, that's fine sense. But all those things do go together, and they always have. And so, to me, it's helpful to notice in Genesis 4:15 and places like that when we just see that God is always the same. So, any thoughts about that? Okay. If we continue then in verse 16, he says, Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And she built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. And so sometimes the problem that people have with this section is God says that Cain's sort of discipline is that he's going to be, it says, a vagabond and a wanderer. He's not going to really have a home. He's always going to wander about place to place. But then in the next two verses it says that he went and built a city, and so that sounds very much like the opposite of a vagabond and a wanderer. And so people say, it sometimes casts some doubt on people about the truthfulness or the veracity of the Bible, because how is it that just 2 verses earlier God can say this is what your life will be, and then 2 verses later he's allowed to build a city? And so I wanted to kind of think about that for a minute, because you don't want little things like that to trip you up and cause you any kind of doubt in your faith. Or sometimes you're just talking to someone and you think, man, if I just knew how to correlate those things in a biblical way, maybe I could kind of help them a little bit with their faith because they seem to be struggling. And so, first thing that we notice in verse 17, it says, and he built a city. Literally, in the original language, it was, he was building a city. And that's one thing that's kind of frustrating or just an extra layer to the translations is oftentimes whenever we would talk in like a normal way, we would say, he is jumping. But if we're talking about ourselves and what we're doing right now, we would say, I am jumping. It's like I've started to jump and I haven't yet finished jumping. I'm in the middle of jumping. Oftentimes in the Bible, that's one of the most common sort of tenses that they use. And so it will say, he walked to Galilee. In English, in the original language, it would often literally say he was walking to Galilee. Sort of the idea of he had started to walk to Galilee, he wasn't yet to Galilee, and so the story takes place on the way to Galilee, as an example, if that were what it said. And so it says he was building a city. It never says he finished it. It never says that he lived there. Right? If I had been cursed to walk the earth, but I had a wife, I think, if I could, I might build her a city to live in and then, go fulfill my punishment. But why should she have to walk around with me everywhere, And so, he's having this son. His wife and son need a secure place to live. It's going to be a lot easier than wandering around. And so, perhaps that's what he did. But there's a lot that it doesn't say. It doesn't say that he finished the city. It doesn't say that he ever lived in the city. And really, if we're talking about a city, I think of Dallas, right? If we're talking about a city, I think of San Antonio or Houston or skyscrapers and, those kinds of things, modern development. But to them, a city literally could be a couple of walls. It had some kind of enclosure. It could be tents inside. Just tents. It could be houses of wood or stone or mud or something, but maybe like 2 or 3, and they would call that a city because there's just sort of how we use words is a little bit differently than how they use words, and so to say that he built a city, if we're talking about a couple of mud huts and a wall around it, is certainly not to say that he never wandered the earth. And in fact, that's often what wanderers and, Native Americans would do that. They would come to a place, they would put up a wall and build a city, and have their tents inside of it. And then when the season was over, they'd pack it all up, tear the wall down, and go to a new place. And they would wander season to season, or when they would get raided by a different tribe, they'd do that. Peoples have often done things like that. There's really, no reason to say that when Abraham wandered the Canaan land, that he didn't put up temporary walls around him and call it a city. But then, 6 months later, he's moved on to a new place, and he wandered the Canaan land. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, Scott, so I'm going to bring back our conversation from last week.
Okay,
so
good.
We talked about the time.
How long has it been? Yes.
Because that also brings in the question of who was his wife, and who are these people who are going to be
Good, okay.
after him,
Yes.
because there had to have been time passed.
Yes.
So that generations could have been established, because otherwise there would have been no one else to be looking to kill him.
Yes.
Because he would have been the only one left.
Yes.
Besides Cain.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve.
If it's just Adam and Eve and
So
Cain and Abel, then there's
that
just
also
3 people.
that also comes into play here.
Yes.
Who was his wife?
Who was
Couldn't
his
have
wife?
been Sister.
Yes.
Probably wasn't his sister. So it had to be other
Yes.
family members that were born in this time before Adam and Eve maybe had Cain and Abel, or
Right.
after, but they
Okay.
had such long lives.
So that's a really good question. And that's, he clearly has a wife, and we don't know anything about her other than that she bore a son named Enoch. But she has to come from somewhere, right? And so I think that's a really good question. It kind of naturally extends from what we're talking about now, that he is wandering the earth with this woman, but before he even begins wandering the earth, he says in verse 14, he says, I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. And so, that's a really common ancient world thought. If I kill you, your brother or your father or your somebody is going to come take vengeance on it. And the Israelites knew that, and God knew that, and that's why God set up the Levite cities of refuge. And so there were, I think, maybe about 6 of them. And if you accidentally killed someone, it's just like what we call manslaughter today, you could run to the city and hide there and have sort of a trial, and they called him, was it the Avenger of Blood, I think? Is that, yeah, the Avenger of Blood, the man's brother who you killed, who's going to come, kill you in response, an eye for an eye kind of thing. He can't come in the city and kill you. He's not supposed to anyway, And so that was how they thought of things. And even now, there's enough time that has passed that there's enough culture that although nobody, we understand it to be that nobody has been killed before, there's enough culture among the people there for Cain to understand that this is what someone would do. And that's not hard to, I imagine Cain, all he has to do is just think, if somebody else had killed my brother, I would want to kill them. It's like, that's just like a natural human sort of instinct. And so where do these people come from? So as we consider that, remember what we looked at last week in Genesis 5 and verse 2. Genesis 5:2, where Moses is sort of recapping Adam and Eve's life. He says he created the male and female, and he blessed them, and he called them mankind in the day they were created. And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. And so we know that, the way that it's presented is that Seth was born and that Eve was comforted by his birth after losing Abel. And so we can make the understanding that Abel died before Seth was born, but that Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. And so you're looking at a range of 130 years from when Adam, his birthday, to the point that Seth is born, that Cain and Abel are themselves born and grow up old enough to be able to present offerings to God and strong enough to take action for one of them to kill the other one. And that's, when you think about that, it's pretty conceivable that he could even be 100 years old, that Cain himself could be 100 years old at this point. And maybe even a little bit older. That seems pretty conceivable because he's the firstborn. And we know that they were commanded to be fruitful. And so we assume that they got pregnant just as quickly as they probably could. And so, he could be pretty close to 130 years old himself, but easily 100 years old at this point in time. And when I was looking up some of these things, the Associated Press, if y'all are unfamiliar with the Associated Press, and probably most of you know it, it's just I'm sorry. Wow.
Yeah. Just say that sounds like Apologetics Press.
Thank you. Associated Press is what we used when we were in journalism, and that was an old lifetime that AP, they both start with the same thing. So the Apologetics Press, if you are not familiar with the Apologetics Press, they have really great information that kind of helps with some of these things. But they had done some math, and I let them do the math because I'm bad at math, and so I'm using their math. But their math is this: if Adam and Eve had one child every 2 years, and that, I think that's pretty conservative. They could have more often than 2 years, and that was their command. So I think that's a pretty conservative how often they had kids. But if they had one child every 2 years, and then their children married and had children when they were 19 years old, and so I think that's also pretty conservative, because in ancient times, it was not uncommon to get married at like 11, 12, or 13 and begin having children basically as soon as you hit puberty. So they're really being very conservative with their math here. If they had one child every 2 years and their children married at 19 years old and had children on average, then by the time that Cain was 100, and he could be a little bit older, there would already be 100 people on the earth. 100 people. And so, you think like that's Cain, and maybe he already has a family and children, maybe not. That's Abel. He could have been married and had children. And then we know that chapter 4 and verse, it's in chapter 5. Chapter 5 and verse 4 says that Adam had other sons and daughters. And so, and it doesn't necessarily say that they had Cain and then Abel and then Seth, 130, there could have been a lot of children born in between that time period. And so,
and we're still thinking in terms of our bodies at this time.
Sure. God
created perfect bodies back then.
Yes.
Without defect, without disease.
Mm-hmm.
And it took generations of generations before that finally even started happening.
Yes.
Because we saw at one time the lifespan started dropping off.
Drop down.
But those lifespans, they were in perfect health at 200, 300, 400 years old.
They're not going to have as much trouble having children.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there could potentially be conservatively, easily, 100 people on the earth. I think well over that. By the time that Cain is 100 years old, and he's probably older when Seth is born. And so, you think, here are all of these people who come from Adam and Eve, and that then, I think, is who you're looking at as far as who are all the people that Cain is concerned about. He's concerned about all of his siblings and nieces and nephews, and great nieces and nephews, essentially, who when they hear about this, are going to be mad, right? You're the only people on earth, and there's just a few hundred of you, and one of you has killed the other one, and you're thinking, now why wouldn't he do that to me? Or my children, or my wife, or whatever, And suddenly it becomes very serious. There's only a few of us. We're supposed to be multiplying. He's subtracting. We got to get rid of that guy. And from a justice perspective, they're not wrong. And I think that's God. It doesn't necessarily say that these people would have been wrong to have wanted to exact justice, other than that God had already divvied out justice. God had given out the discipline, the consequences. And at that point, it's wrong for us to add consequences to what God has done. And so that's why God says, nobody kill him, because I've already taken care of it. This is what I'm choosing to do in my righteousness, in my judgment, to Cain for what he has done. And so if someone's going to come behind it, we got to get rid of this guy. He's saying, you're stepping over your bounds. I'm the judge, you're not. But that's a natural human instinct, and that's why Cain's so worried, and that's because you have all of his siblings and his nieces and nephews. And so then, from there kind of continuing with what Melanie is talking about, if you look in verse 16, it says that he left the presence of the Lord, and he went to the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And so the kind of question becomes, who was living in Nod? And then it says in verse 17, and Cain knew his wife. And so where did Mrs. Cain come from? Who is she, and how does she fit into all of this? Because oftentimes it's common for people to say that in some way or another, a bunch of people are already living in Nod. There's a whole big population out there. Maybe even that God created another group of people, or there's a lot of thoughts about like, who are these people in Nod and where do they come from? And so here's some points just to kind of help us clear up what he's talking about here. First, the word Nod means wandering. It means to wander around. And that's what Cain's punishment was, or his discipline was, to go wander around. And so when it says that Cain went to the land of Nod, what it sounds like that's saying is Cain left where God was and went to an already established place called Nod and wandered around for a while and then built a city. But the truth is, we often do this too, what Moses is doing. Moses is referring to a place that later was called Nod, so that the people knew what he was talking about. That doesn't mean that Cain called it that, or that the people at that time called it. And so that's, we do this all the time. If you watch like a documentary about the president, it'll say, the president was born on February 6, 1911. Anyone know which president that was, February 6, 1911? The president was born on February 6, 1911, but he wasn't the president on February 6, 1911. He was a baby, and so, but we call him the president after the fact, even when we talk about events that happened in his life before the fact, so that we know who we're talking about, because we all know that. But nobody thinks that he was the president on the day he was born. Or, I could say, my wife and I dated for 2 years before we got married. Well, she wasn't my wife the 2 years that we were dating, but you all know her as my wife. And so that's a common way that I refer to her, that you would know who I'm talking about, even though it's not actually what we would have called her in the 2 years that we were dating. And
that's because and there's several examples in here where they give both names in both places.
Yes.
It was called this before because of the audience that are reading this.
Yes.
Moses wrote this for the Israelites. They knew of this place today
as this land.
as this place.
Right. And that makes it real. If a long time ago Texas had been called, whatever they called it long, long ago, and you're reading a book about this place that, it's a cool place, and they call it this thing, and no one ever says, this is Texas, you have no idea. You're reading about your own home, right? And so he's saying, we walked through Nod. I don't think they did, but he's saying, about these places, you went to these places, and that's in Exodus chapter 6, God tells us that his name, Yahweh, is not a name that the ancient people from before then knew him by. Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah, all those people, even Abraham, never knew the name Yahweh. He didn't share that until Moses. But in the whole book of Genesis, we're told that Abraham calls him Yahweh when he refers to him, and he talks about all these people like they knew the name Yahweh. He doesn't do that because they knew it. He does that because that's how the Israelites knew it. And so he's sort of, putting that word in their mouth in a way that they will understand it. And so it's accurate because he is Yahweh, and that's going to be easiest for them to understand. But it's not what they actually called him, and they're sure to clarify that for us so that we know that's not what they actually called him, for accuracy's sake, because they didn't actually know that name. And so the Bible does this a lot. There's another place in Genesis 13 and verse 3. Genesis 13 and verse 3, we're told that Abram went to Bethel. But then we're told in Genesis chapter 28 and verse 19 that Jacob went to this place and named it Bethel. Well, this is after Abraham has died. Abram went to a place that was later called Bethel, but Abram never knew it by that name. But Moses says Abram went to Bethel because that's how, at that time, everybody knew it. And so Nod is not a place that's maybe necessarily full of populated. This is Nod. We all live here. Welcome, Cain. Come wander in your cursed state. That's what they called it later. Probably, I think, because Cain wandered there, and that was his curse. And so it doesn't say that people live there. It also doesn't say that Cain's wife came from there. Notice in verse 16 it says that he went and dwelt there, and then verse 17 it says, and Cain knew his wife. It doesn't say, and Cain married and knew his wife, or he went to those people wherever they come from. They already could have been married and probably were before they went there. But once they were there, that's when they conceived their son. Yes.
Is it possible that Enoch was born before he killed Abel? Because it doesn't really look like it's necessarily using time.
I think it is possible.
And so
Yeah.
the way that it's all organized,
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily chronological.
Right.
So it's like Enoch and Irad, and there could have been several
generations by the
already
time.
born before he killed Abel.
I think that it's very possible, especially if you think Cain is probably more than 100 years old at this point, or could be anyway. If he were, then
The first statement, I didn't hear what.
she was saying, is it possible that Enoch, Cain's son, Enoch, and maybe even further generations beyond Enoch were already born when Cain killed Abel? And that really is very possible, because as she's pointing out, he's giving this account in Genesis, but when he switches to verses 16 in the chronology, he's not necessarily concerned about where in Cain's life all of these things fall. He's just giving us the information. And as we looked at in a sermon some time ago, he's giving us some moral points within these chronologies. And so they're not even necessarily, supposed to be taken as like this person, then this person. There's a moral point that's more important to Moses than how we do genealogies today with like a date and, the mother and the father as far back as we can find it. That's not really his point. And so, yes, it's entirely possible that Enoch is already born, and maybe several generations before any of this happens, especially if he really is close to 130 years old when all of these events take place. You figure it is not the Associated Press, if the Apologetics Press is right, and they didn't get married, or is right in their guess that he got married at 19, it's odd to think he'd wait nearly 100 years to have his first son. And odds are he probably got married before 19. The odd thing, so, yes, ma'am.
If he was that old when he killed Abel, Abel couldn't have been too old. I mean, he could have been older too. He may have had some children.
I think so, yeah, it seems very likely.
So maybe he would be a little fearful of them too, with that.
That would be the Avenger of Blood, is his children. I think so. And so you're looking at multiple generations all coming from the same family. Now the only other thing I would say to that is when you look through Genesis chapter 5, sometimes it does say that people did wait. In Genesis 5:12, Canaan lived 70 years and begot Mahalalel. That doesn't mean that was his first child necessarily. That's the one that's important. And so, but it could be that he was 70 when he had that child, So it's hard to say for sure how old any of them were when some of these things happened, because that's not the point of it. But the point is we're talking about the possibilities. And it is impossible to say that that the Bible is sort of contradicting itself when the point is not to give us an accurate, like blow-by-blow genealogy. The point is to give us moral lessons and to get us from point A to point B. And so it doesn't say that Cain's wife came from Nod. And odds are, Sarah's right, they're probably already married and maybe even already had kids. But once he's there, he builds this little bitty city, or big city, or whatever it is, and he names it after his firstborn son, because that's who's supposed to inherit the city. Which is why I lean toward the idea that he built this for his wife and his son to live in, even though he may have still continued to wander the earth. The other thing is, God told him what his punishment would be. It doesn't necessarily mean that he tried to obey it. He may have tried to stay in a place, and then providence pushed him on, to the next place. And that's just because the judge says that you're going to go to prison doesn't mean you don't try to break out, right? And so you try to break out, but then they catch you and they put you back in prison. Cain's told he'll be a vagabond and a wanderer, but he tries to build a city, and maybe his wife and kid live there, maybe not, but then providence works to drive him out of the city, and he wanders some more. And so just because he built a city and disobeyed that doesn't mean that God was inaccurate to say what he would do. God may have to keep coming along and saying, you got to move on now, Cain, The fact that he built a city isn't really a commentary on that at all. And so, but...
the important point is the last verse.
And
that's what he's trying to get to.
Yes, the last, you were talking about verse...
of the chapter.
26, yeah. Yeah, that's what he's getting to. He's getting to Seth, so you can talk about Seth's family. Cain is really just kind of a bump in the road as far as that's concerned. And so when you're looking at... Melanie, when you're looking at who are these people and who was his wife, it seems to me that the indication is Adam and Eve had a bunch of children, and those children, as strange as it is to us today, they married one another. And really, I was trying to look into this, and it felt very strange to be Googling these things, but even 100 years ago, it was not uncommon for people to marry their first cousin. And it's like that was not today. That's considered strange in our culture, but 100 years ago it was not uncommon, and it wasn't terribly far along ago in history that people did still marry their brothers and sisters. And so to us it seems very out of place. Maybe not all of us, but to most of us it seems very out of place today. But really historically that's not that uncommon. And you think the reason why people don't do that today, the reason why brothers and sisters and cousins don't marry today primarily is because genetically it tends to cause problems for your children. But as Johnny was saying, they had perfect genes, and so they wouldn't have had those same troubles. Brother and sister could marry and have a child with because that's what happens is, and you all know, 23 chromosomes come from each parent. But if you have the same parents yourselves, then there tend to be duplicate chromosomes, and because our genetics are, we have mutations and they're diluted. Those duplicate chromosomes are what cause genetic problems in children that come from brothers and sisters. And that's why you marry someone who's not your brother or sister, because you don't get duplicates, and it keeps the child more likely to be healthy. That would not have been a problem in their time period. Yes, ma'am?
Well, God had a plan.
I'm sorry?
God had a plan.
He had a plan.
He had a plan for people on this earth.
That's right.
To populate.
Yes.
Covered all.
Right. Well, and that's, have you ever, I'm not that old, but even as young as I am, sometimes I watch what younger people than me do, and I think, how weird. I just have no sense of or concept of why would they even think of that, And so that's I imagine that Adam and Eve, if they knew our culture, would say, how weird. But in like manner, we look back and we say, how weird is marrying your brother and sister? What else did they know? That,
Flood, they would have to.
and at the flood again, and some people say, well, it was against God's law to marry your brother and sister, and that's only true by the time you get to Moses, and that's Moses records that in Leviticus 18:6. Leviticus 18:6 and following is a whole chapter about who you can't marry and so forth, and it has a lot of emphasis on not marrying your siblings or anyone that you're related to too closely. And so by the time of Moses, you already have, I think, dilution of genetics, the wearing down of genetics, so that it's not safe anymore. But the Bible doesn't record that God ever required that of people before that time, and logically he must have allowed it because their genetics were fine. And so to me that's a really interesting, it's another point of kind of scientific foreknowledge. We're talking about the things that God must have known, but that the people at the time didn't know, and then later, God is so big on taking, your bathroom out and then covering it up. But you read historical documents and they found weird things about that. So they didn't know about germs, and how did the Israelites know to do that when no other culture did it? Well, God told them to because he knew what was best, even if they didn't understand germ theory. God God knew that the genetics were at a point where they couldn't be siblings having children anymore, even if Moses never gave that a thought. I think, I know I saw Sarah, yeah.
Weren't Moses' parents, wasn't Jochebed like Amram's great aunt?
I want to say she was his
She
aunt or his
one of
great aunt, yes.
Levi's last children, and
Yes.
then Amram was like one of Levi's first children's.
Yeah, they're pretty closely related, yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. And so even Moses' own parents, pretty closely related. But by Moses' time, he's saying, I don't remember if aunts specifically, if that's close enough in Moses' time or not, but you see it broadening and broadening as time goes on, who you're not really supposed to marry. And that is a consequence of sin, is what you're looking at. I saw another hand too, though, but nobody wants to own it, I guess. So, okay. So we're about out of time. So just to kind of wrap up that thought, they wouldn't have known anything else, and so it wouldn't have seemed strange to them. And so, it's like they couldn't have been brothers and sisters. They really were. He would have married his sister or maybe his niece, Abel, or somebody else's daughter, and they would have had a son, Enoch. And if we were alive back then, we wouldn't have thought it was weird either. It would have just been perfectly normal. And all of the people who he was concerned about would have just been all his relatives from Adam and Eve. And that is to me the best way to look at the evidence of what God did and kind of put it all together. And it really is very consistent, I think, in Genesis 4 biblically. It's very consistent. And with that understanding, there's really I'd be curious to know like what other holes do we see, because I'm not personally seeing any other holes as far as that goes. But we will close there today, and we can pick up talking about these things more next week. And thank you so much for your attention and for looking at Genesis 4 with me this morning.
Somebody's working on the transmission?